Slavery, a practice as old as human civilization, has manifested in various forms across time and geography. While most people today associate slavery with the transatlantic slave trade and the horrors of American slavery, it is important to realize that slavery existed in nearly every corner of the world. Its evolution, treatment of the enslaved, and eventual abolition took on distinct forms depending on the society in which it operated. To understand the reality of slavery in America compared to its existence everywhere else, one must take a global perspective, recognizing both the commonalities and the stark differences in how this brutal institution was organized and justified. The roots of slavery stretch back to ancient civilizations like Mesopotamia, Egypt, Greece, Rome, China, and India, where people were enslaved through conquest, debt, or as punishment for crimes. In these societies, slavery was a ubiquitous practice, but the treatment of slaves varied greatly. In some instances, slaves were regarded as valuable household servants or skilled laborers, while in others, they were subjected to extreme forms of degradation. The Roman Empire, for example, practiced a form of slavery in which the enslaved could be highly educated, even running households or estates, and in some cases, they could buy their freedom. However, the specter of exploitation, violence, and brutal punishments always hung over the lives of the enslaved, no matter where they were held. When it comes to American slavery, the transatlantic slave trade specifically, the system was underpinned by a racial ideology that would cast a long shadow over future generations. This form of slavery, which evolved in the 17th century and intensified in the 18th century, involved the forced transportation of millions of Africans to the Americas. The brutal conditions of this Atlantic journey, known as the Middle Passage, were one of the defining features of the transatlantic slave trade. Africans were packed into ships, shackled, and deprived of basic human needs, resulting in a high mortality rate. The survivors of this horrifying journey were sold as property, their humanity stripped away by a system designed to exploit them for economic gain. American slavery differed significantly from other forms of slavery primarily due to its scale, its racialized nature, and the extremity of its conditions. In the United States, slavery became institutionalized through laws that codified the status of enslaved Africans as property. Slaves in the U.S. were subjected to grueling labor, particularly on plantations where the cultivation of cotton, tobacco, and sugar required intense and continuous effort. They were stripped of their legal rights, denied education, and were frequently separated from their families as they were bought and sold on a commercial market. Plantation owners implemented draconian measures to keep slaves under control, using whippings, mutilation, rape, and even execution to maintain dominance. In contrast, slavery in other parts of the world, though still brutal and dehumanizing, operated under different social, cultural, and economic circumstances. In the Islamic world, for instance, slavery was widespread, but the enslaved occupied a more complex status within society. Slavery in the Muslim world, governed in part by Islamic law Sharia, permitted enslaved people certain rights that did not exist in American slavery. Slaves could own property, marry, and in some cases rise to positions of influence and power. The Mamluks of Egypt, for example, were slave soldiers who eventually became rulers of the country. Additionally, manumission, or the freeing of slaves, was seen as a virtuous act in Islam, and enslaved people often had a clearer pathway to freedom than those in the American system. However, this does not erase the inherent violence and exploitation involved in the capture and sale of slaves in the Muslim world. In Africa, slavery took on multiple forms, varying across regions and time periods. Long before the transatlantic slave trade, Africans practiced forms of slavery within their own societies. This often involved prisoners of war, debtors, or people being punished for crimes. However, unlike the racialized slavery that developed in the Americas, African slavery was not based on skin color. Enslaved people were often incorporated into their captors' households, sometimes even achieving high status or marrying into the family. Nevertheless, when European demand for slaves increased dramatically, the nature of African slavery changed, and many African societies became deeply involved in the transatlantic slave trade. This trade would decimate populations, disrupt societies, and entrench a global system of racial exploitation that would reverberate for centuries. In Europe, slavery had largely disappeared by the time the transatlantic slave trade began. Medieval Europe practiced forms of serfdom, where peasants were bound to the land and forced to labor for the landowner, but this was distinct from chattel slavery. By the time of the Enlightenment, many European countries began to wrestle with the moral and ethical implications of slavery, which led to gradual abolitionist movements. The British Empire, which had been deeply complicit in the slave trade, became one of the leading forces behind its abolition. In 1807, Britain passed the Abolition of the Slave Trade Act, which was followed by the Slavery Abolition Act in 1833, ending slavery throughout the British Empire. This marked a significant difference in the trajectory of slavery compared to the United States, where slavery continued until the Civil War of the 1860s. The comparison between American slavery and slavery elsewhere highlights not only different legal and social frameworks, but also varying degrees of brutality. American slavery was fundamentally tied to the notion of race, creating a rigid racial hierarchy that would perpetuate racial inequality long after slavery was officially abolished. Other systems of slavery, while brutal and oppressive, did not always have the same racial components and, in some instances, provided pathways to. In Latin America and the Caribbean, slavery also took on distinct forms. Brazil, which received the largest number of African slaves in the transatlantic trade, had a brutal plantation system similar to that in the southern United States. Yet, Brazil also had a more fluid racial hierarchy, and the presence of a large population of free people of African descent allowed for greater social mobility among former slaves. Despite this, the conditions on Brazilian plantations were often as severe, if not worse, than those in the U.S. The mortality rate among slaves in Brazil was staggering due to overwork, disease, and harsh punishments. Manumission was more common than in the U.S., but the overall system was still deeply exploitative. In places like the Caribbean, where sugar plantations dominated, the conditions for slaves were arguably worse than in both the United States and Brazil. The brutal labor required to cultivate and process sugarcane resulted in high death rates, and the constant need for more laborers meant that slaveholders had little interest in the health or welfare of their slaves. Rebellions were frequent in the Caribbean, as slaves sought to escape the unbearable conditions. The Haitian Revolution, which began in 1791, was the most successful of these uprisings, leading to the establishment of Haiti as the first black republic in the world and the abolition of slavery there. The aftermath of slavery also took on different forms across the globe. In the United States, the abolition of slavery through the 13th Amendment in 1865 was followed by the brief period of Reconstruction, during which African Americans made significant political and social gains. However, the end of Reconstruction saw the rise of Jim Crow laws and a resurgence of white supremacy, which continued to oppress African Americans for decades. The legacies of American slavery, systemic racism, economic disparity, and social exclusion persist to this day. Elsewhere, the abolition of slavery was followed by a range of outcomes. In the British Empire, former slaves were often forced into systems of apprenticeship that extended their exploitation. In Brazil, the abolition of slavery in 1888, the last country in the Western Hemisphere to do so, left the majority of former slaves without land or resources, pushing them into poverty. In the Middle East and Africa, slavery persisted in some regions well into the 20th century, long after it had been abolished elsewhere. In conclusion, while slavery was a global institution, its manifestations and consequences differed based on geography, culture, and historical context. American slavery was unique in its scale, its racial foundations, and the depth of its brutality, but slavery in other parts of the world was no less oppressive or dehumanizing. The legacies of slavery continue to shape societies, economies, and racial dynamics around the world, making it essential to understand not just the American experience but the broader global history of this tragic institution.